When most people think of legislation, they think about bills and acts of parliament, primary legislation, but actually the majority of legislation that affects all of us, millions of people across the country in our daily lives, is actually through what's known as delegated or secondary legislation. Acts of Parliament provide the framework into which much of the real detail and impact of the law will subsequently be added through delegated legislation, and the majority of that is made in the form of what we know as statutory instruments. They exist within the framework of powers that are delegated to ministers by Parliament in the Parental Act, and they can be used to fill out, to update, sometimes even amend existing primary legislation without Parliament having to pass a new act. Unlike primary legislation, delegated legislation is subject to judicial review, so it's incredibly important that Parliament and ministers get it right. Scope of delegated legislation can vary considerably, from the really technical power that's procedural in character to a quite wide-ranging power known as a Henry VIII power that can, for example, abolish quangos, as we saw just a few years ago with the Public Bodies Act. In recent years, we've seen a range of factors: the expansion of the regulatory state, the wide range of social security provision, the rapidly changing nature of technology, the growth in legislation from the European Union. All these factors have contributed to a significant increase in the volume, the technicality, and the complexity of delegated legislation. But what we're finding, and what we look at in our report, is how Parliament deals with this legislation is completely unsatisfactory given its importance. The way in which both the delegation and its scrutiny is treated isn't systematic, and it's not consistent. The procedures are complex, they're often illogical, and actually many parliamentarians, particularly MPs, willingly admit they just don't understand them. The language of delegated legislation, made and laid, negative, affirmative, super-affirmative, prayers, Henry VIII powers, it's all completely confusing and undermines parliamentary and public understanding of this important area of the law. Our report sets out a number of recommendations to reform the delegated legislation system, both in Whitehall and at Westminster. But ultimately we think that they will really only ameliorate the problems. They won't tackle the fundamental issues at the heart of the system in relation to the scope of powers that are being sought, the appropriate balance between primary and secondary legislation, the complexity and the inconsistent allocation of scrutiny procedures, and the engagement of members in the scrutiny process. For that, we think a much more wide-ranging review is required. The issues, frankly, are now so serious that an independent expert inquiry is needed along the lines of that undertaken way back in 1975 by David Renton on the preparation of legislation, or our own commission on making the law chaired by Lord Ripon in 1993. It needs to review the entire legislative process, looking at how both primary and secondary legislation is prepared in Whitehall, scrutinised in Westminster. It should look at the issues of principle and practice, where the balance should be between administrative and political convenience and good legislative process. It needs to look at the rationalisation of the scrutiny procedures. At the moment, there are 16 variations on the scrutiny procedures for delegated legislation. That's just far too complex. We need to explore what criteria and principles define what it is that members of both Houses of Parliament want to look at again in the arena of delegated legislation, and how that can be best achieved. And we ought to look at whether the burden on members to scrutinise delegation should be reduced, for example through the introduction of individuals or independent advisory bodies with genuine technical expertise in particular policy areas, that they can help members scrutinise these important areas of regulation. We're calling for this new inquiry into the legislative process to be set up shortly after the next general election, so after May 2015, by the new government. And it's got to look at some important issues of a constitutional nature as well. Whether the scrutiny system should be redesigned so that a greater burden of work falls on the House of Lords in future. The scrutiny process for delegated legislation is better, frankly, in the Lords than it is in the Commons. And is there scope to extend that and to improve the scrutiny still further, for the Lords to take up a greater burden of this really technical, complex work? And secondly, there are some really important constitutional debates that affect delegated legislation. For example, the direction of the devolved settlement following the Scottish independence referendum, the issue of English votes for English laws. How does that affect not just primary legislation in the House of Commons and House of Lords, but also delegated legislation? So these are some key issues that need to be ironed out, and we think that this inquiry is the best way forward.